Hello. It is the morning after the spoiler for Tarkir Dragonstorm fully dropped. So I've had a little bit of time to go through it. Um, what I this is my spoiler video, my kind of set review. And what we're gonna do on the channel is each of Jared, Trent, and I are probably each gonna post our own set review videos if we have time. Recording times for us tends to be a little bit challenging. Our time zones are not structured in a way we're getting together, the three of us or even two of us, to do like a long form kind of podcast style video about a set is especially easy currently. So we like to use that time for gameplay. So we're gonna do set review content, probably a bit more singular. Like one, each of us are gonna do it by ourselves. We're release some short form content too. But yeah, this is my set review. I tend to be kind of like a Johnny, like Timmy Johnny, when it comes to set review season, even if um, that's not necessarily how it progresses for me when I play. I'm maybe a little spikier, but for me, I'm always pretty excited to talk about what cards can do, and I'm willing to believe that I'm maybe sometimes a little bit too uh too ambitious in my evaluations of cards, and it's maybe a little bit too much of Magical Christmas Land. But my set review has a lot of cards in it, and hopefully it's not going to be crazy long. But let's get into the PowerPoint. I have shamelessly stolen this idea from Aspiring Spike because I really like the way that he does set reviews, so I've done something kind of comparable here. Um, Obviously, it might well pale in comparison, but I've taken the core concept at least. So yeah, my title screen. I feel like I'm back in school. In terms of how I have categorized cards, rather than going by like color or by shard or something like that, I decided to categorize them based on how I think they're going to impact the format. So category one is high impact staples. The I isn't capitalized because this presentation is a little scuffed. I did write it in bed last night. So these are cards that like are going to go in decks immediately, are going to be very good in decks immediately. Like these are cards where when your opponent plays it, you kind of lean back in your seat and go, oh god, that one. Some examples from previous sets, like recent sets, might be like Bright Glass Cure Hulk is a good example, where like that card's very good. Obviously, it doesn't go into every single deck because of the color constraints, but when you play Bright Glass Cure Hulk, your opponent goes, oh god, I'm probably dead. That's the kind of thing we're looking for here. We're looking for cards that are going to be playable across a variety of decks and are going to be actively very good. The next category is format role players. These are cards that are playable, and you're definitely going to see them. They maybe don't make it into every deck. Maybe you only reach for them in specific spots or specific metas. But I think they're playable cards, and they might get better or worse as other cards get printed. The next category I have is kind of a weird one. It's great in one deck or playable in one deck. There, in this set in particular, there's kind of a couple of subset of cards that uh, are good in exactly one strategy and are probably unplayable everywhere else, but I'll talk about those ones. Then the next category I have is I will definitely die to this card. Um, these are cards that have raw power, but are probably not either not synergistic enough or they're like a little bit too expensive to fit in the format, but the effect is really powerful and swingy. And I will say I will definitely die to this card, but some of these are aspirational for me as well. These are cards that I want to be playing and killing people with. I think they're like very sweet. But these are definitely cards that are more on the sweet side than they are on the like high impact, really playable side. But they're cards that I kind of have highlighted as I want to try and cast this at least once. And then the last category I have is probably not, but let's talk in 3 years. These are for cards that don't currently have a deck, but are powerful, and maybe if in the long term, like more cards that support them get printed, maybe they end up being playable in a particular archetype. But the archetype, I think, at least in my estimation, is not functional yet. I will also say, just as an early caveat, I can be wrong. Part of the fun of doing these videos this way is so that you can go look back at them and joke about how right or wrong you were about certain things. So please let me know in the comments how you feel about any of these cards. If you think I'm totally off base, or if if you think that I nailed it, I'm going to be very interested to hear what people are thinking for sure. So without further ado, let's get into category 1, the high impact staples. Um, this set is pretty powerful, honestly. Like standard sets, because they have commander products with them most of the time, a lot of our staples tend to be commander cards, to be honest. But this set actually has uh, several cards that are coming from the mainline set that I think fall into the category of being high impact staples. So let's start with Clarion Conqueror. So this is a 3-mana 3/3 flying. It casts for 2 and a white, so it's pretty easy to cast, and it has one of the most absurd text boxes I've read in a while. It says activated abilities of artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers can't be activated. So this is like an absurd hate bear, and definitely the best hate bear they've printed in like, I don't know, 5 years, something like that. In terms of what this does, it is worth noting that like it's not one-sided. Then I think this thing would just be so oppressive. But when you're looking at the combo decks that this impacts, it's almost easier to list the ones that this doesn't impact, because by my count, when I was kind of thinking about it, the only combo decks in the format that get to kind of sneer and mock at this card are like Thoracle doesn't mind this coming into play. It's fine. And like Underworld Breach, maybe. No, Underworld Breach doesn't like this card because you can't activate your Lotus or your LED, so it's good against that one. Like Flash Hulk is dead to this card, Nadu is dead to this card, and by dead I mean they can't go off, is pretty dead to this card. Most of the Storm decks are at least significantly hampered by this card. Like High Tide can ignore this card, Thoracle can ignore this card, Doomsday can conditionally ignore this card, but it at least makes the lines more complicated. And then the other thing is like, oh, and all of the Academy decks hate to see this card come into play. Like Citadel Storm gets to like maybe play through it, but even then it does make your life more complicated. It also just like splash hates Planeswalkers, which I think is interesting, although won't come up nearly as much. But yeah, Clarion Conqueror is like a 10 out of 10 in decks that are looking to do hate bearsy things. This is like a slam dunk every time. This text box is like already very good. And like kind of comparable to Collect Roof, which is a card that I think you would like to be able to play. But Collect Roof is like a bear. It's just a 2/2. It's like pretty embarrassing. Whereas Clarion Conqueror being like a 3/3 flyer for 3 means that not only is this going to be useful in the matchups where it's preventing combo decks from going off, but even in the matchups where it's not necessarily preventing a combo deck from going off or having like a ton of text in that sense, it's still just like a 3/3 flyer that can attack and block really well. I was going to say it can hold equipment well, but it actually turns off your ability to do that too. So you do want to be careful about playing this when you're behind, I guess, potentially. But yeah, 10 out of 10. I think this card is really good, and you'll see it around a lot. Terrifying. I'm not happy to see this card in the format. The next card I have in the staples category, this one, the word staple is doing some heavy lifting, I think. So this is Songcrafter Mage. This is a 3-mana 3/2 flash. It casts for Temur mana, so green, blue, red. And it says, when this creature enters, target instant or sorcery in your graveyard gains Harmonize until end of turn. And what Harmonize is, this is a new keyword from Tarkir Dragonstorm. Harmonize says, you may cast that card from your graveyard for its Harmonize cost. You may tap a creature you control to reduce that cost by X, where X is its power. Then you exile the spell. So, what does this card do? It's not Snapcaster Mage number 2, right? Like that's the obvious reference point, and it's close to Snapcaster, but it is worse, I think. For one thing, the casting cost is like much more prohibitive, and it does cost 3. It's worth noting, like, if you're using this to flashback a 1-cost spell, you are paying more mana than you would if you were Snapcastering. But if you're getting back a 2-cost where one of the pips is generic and you can just use the Songcrafter Mage to pay for it, like to pay the Harmonize, okay, then you're on a comparable rate. And where Songcrafter starts to get pretty enticing from my perspective is when you're trying to get back like 4 and 5-cost spells. um, all of a sudden you can really like start to like gain advantage out of that as well. So one of the ones that like came to mind for me is like this lets you recast Mystic Confluence for 5 mana again. You Mystic Confluence, and then the next turn you can go Songcraft or Mystic Confluence, which is like pretty attractive. And this rug mana cost, like the teamer mana cost, is not ideal. And that's why I think maybe the word staple is doing some heavy lifting here, because there are not an abundance of rug decks in the format. There's some 4-color control decks that happen to have rug mana. Like you have like 4-color no black that exists as like a playable deck. There is like a Scapeshift deck, and there's like a mid-range Scapeshift deck that I think you could play that would really like this card. It would be quite good in that deck. And then the other deck that I kind of saw this one potentially sliding into is you see these kind of blue-green mid-range decks, like people call them Simic Slaw, where you're playing ramp spells, counter spells, and then big threats and some big spells that are really swingy. And that deck has routinely splashed white as a way to have access to a bit more interaction. I could see a kind of similar take on that deck splashing red instead. And I will say, like, this card is powerful enough that it is like it incentivizes you to be rug. It is that strong. The other thing about this card that I think is worth mentioning is like the 3/2 stat line versus the 2/1 stat line on Snapcaster. Like this card will just like kill your opponent relatively quickly if you're playing it as like a threat in a kind of like control mirror. This like comes down, gets back a spell, and then gets to start attacking. And yeah, three damage is notably, you know, a good bit more than 2. That's going to be a faster clock. And if you've played enough Snapcaster, you know that a lot of the time you do just end up winning the game with like random Snapcaster beats, and this takes that to another level. So yeah, I really like this card. I don't think it's like Clarion Conqueror level of power, but I do think it's quite a powerful card. I think you will see it in decks. How many remains to be seen, just because the mana cost is a little bit preventative, but mana bases are really good now, and maybe this is even a reason to be rug. We'll see. Whew. I'll take a sip of coffee. Okay, so next we have Ugin, Eye of the Storms. This card's gross. I'm not happy about this card. So this is a 7-mana Planeswalker with 7 loyalty. And it says, when you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Then it also says, whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Yuck. Then it has 3 abilities. It upticks for 2, and you get to gain 3 life and draw a card. It zeros to add 3 colorless mana. And then it's -11. The ultimate is search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, then shuffle. Until end of turn, you may cast those cards without paying their mana costs. This reads win the game in your deck. If it does not, then you have built your deck wrong, probably. So this card, I mean, I think this card looks like it's potentially very good in the Academy shells in particular. So this is a 7-drop that immediately kills something and draws a card if they only have 1 threat on board. And then, especially in those kinds of decks, like if your opponent has maybe like 2 threats going that are you know, being annoying, and you can cast this, and obviously in those kinds of decks you're planning to cast it ahead of schedule, you can go like play this, exile something, zero it, play another artifact. I mean, it's not, I don't think, even that magical Christmas landy to envision this card occasionally exiling 3 things the turn it comes into play. And it just says permanent. It doesn't say non-land. Like, what? Who designed this card? So yeah, I think this card looks like it's probably very strong. The only issue you might run into is the 7 cost, right? You can't jam this into counter spells super freely, but at the same time, in these Academy decks that are like presenting threatening spells all the time and using that to work their way through counter spells, this is another in a long line of must counter spells at this point. So yeah, I think Ugin is like only good in the kind of Academy decks, but I think it's good in basically all of them. Citadel Storm doesn't want to play it just because it's a 7 cost, and I don't think you can like you're not allowed to put one that expensive in your deck. But outside of that, every other deck feels like every other deck that's like making enough mana and has a bunch of colorless cards feels like it probably wants this card. Really, like, just a gnarly card. This thing I think is going to be a bit of a terror in all formats, to be honest, and I don't think Canadian Highlander will be any different. The fact that it's on cast that you get to exile a permanent too. I just read that again. Like, so even if it gets countered, you kill something. Like, just by putting it on the stack, you get to take something off the board. Just seems yep, really gross. Card seems great. Congratulations, Academy players. You got one. Oh, my presentation is going a little nuts. You got a little preview there. So this is the title for this one kind of says it all, but this card I don't think is necessarily a staple in the sense that it'll go in a ton of decks, but holy crap is this card good in Hoof. So this is Nature's Rhythm. This is green X, and it says search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. And then it has Harmonize for 4 green and X. So, like, this, in Hoof in particular, this gets to do something like on turn 3, or maybe turn 2 if you have like a Mox or a Mana Crypt or something. It gets to go get a mana engine, right? It goes and gets Priest of Titania or Raphelos or, you know, some elf that's going to tap for a bunch of mana. Then some turn later, maybe the next turn, maybe 2 turns later, it goes and gets the thing that's going to win the game. Well, we have a cat visiting. So this is, yeah, like, obviously, like, a very high power card, and just getting this kind of, like, double tutor, I think is quite good. One thing that occurred to me that's, like, kind of neat, like, non-trivial, is this does read, like, 9 mana win the game, if you're, well, more or less win the game, if you're, like, a Nadu combo deck, because you can go tap, like, pay 5, get Nadu, and then you just need the 4 green. Oh, cattail, where my face should be. You just need the 4 green, and you can, like, pay the Harmonized cost with the Nadu you just put into play and go get your Nomads or your Sylvan Safekeeper, your what have you. Pretty cool. I don't know if that's going to come up. I suspect the Nadu decks want this card. It's just another relatively efficient way to put Nadu in play, and it also, like, gets to use the back half decently as well. That deck is pretty good at making mana. So yeah, card's very good. It's not like a card that's going to see play in a ton of decks necessarily. Like, you have to be very green, but there are a bunch of green elf decks, and I think in those green elf decks, this card is a slam dunk, and it's very good. Okay, that's all I have for high impact quote unquote staples. I don't think that there are any other cards in this set that I looked at and thought, okay, you know, when my opponent plays this, I'm gonna think it should be pointed or whatever. Those are the 4 where I was sort of like, okay, yeah, these ones I think are a step above in terms of their actual impact on the game. So now we're getting into, like, format role players. These are cards that I think are very playable, and you will definitely see these in a myriad of decks, but they're just like, they're more like they slot in as pieces into the deck, and they're not necessarily like the big draws to playing those decks. So the first one we have here is Rakshasa's Bargain. This one has a really weird casting cost. It costs black, green, blue, but you can replace any of the colored mana for 2 generic mana. So you could pay, like, 2 generic blue-green or 2 generic blue-black, or just pay 3 mana, but it has to be exactly Sultai. It's an instant, and it says, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. So I think you have to be casting this for 3 for it to be worth it. But if you're casting this for 3, this is a really powerful effect. We saw Stock Up from Aether Drift, like, kind of take over Legacy currently. If you're following that format at all, like, it turns out that just, like, drawing 2 cards for 3 mana, and getting to, like, not just have to take 2 off the top, but getting to, like, do some amount of filtering is really strong. And additionally, putting the other cards in the graveyard, I think, is arguably better than putting them in the bin, especially if you're in these colors. So this is, like, a really nice enabler. It's an instant. I don't think there's anything about this card that you could really complain about. Like, if you were playing a Sultai deck that was playing Brain Surge, for example, I kind of think you're likely just playing this one instead now. Maybe Brain Surge is better. It's probably close between those two cards. Start eating a plant. I'm gonna start eating a plant. But yeah, no, I think Rashkasa's Bargain looks to be a pretty reasonable one, pretty playable. The next one I have is Auroral Procession. This is blue-green for an instant, and it's a regrowth. It says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Great effect. Regrowth is a card that for a long time was pretty playable in the Canadian Highlander format, and is now not. I mean, it's not playable, but it's definitely worse than it was, right? Like, it used to be that Regrowth was a card that you were jamming in basically all, like, the blue-green decks, and a lot of green decks were playing Regrowth. It was just, like, a powerful effect. And now, especially the blue decks, like, you don't really want to be tapping out to be regrowthing. You have better things to be doing. But Auroral Procession really fixes a lot of the problems that Regrowth has. Most notably, like, instant versus sorcery is obviously a giant differentiation. This card is Merchant Scrollable, which is interesting. This is like a very good Flash Hulk card in my estimation, since that's a deck that wants to have access to regrowths, and now having one that's kind of easier to tutor for is nice. I really like this card. I think I was talking to Trent about it. We were talking in between recordings the other day, and he was saying it's kind of cool because this is a card that lets you kind of pay half of a Snapcaster Mage cost on an end step. Like, let's say you have a counter spell and something you want to do, and your opponent, like, doesn't do anything, so you don't get to cast your counter spell, but you still want to regrowth the spell that you would have used. Like, you have a counter spell in the graveyard, and you would have Snapcaster Maged it. Well, now you can just still get back the counter spell if you want, like, pay half that cost and be able to do more things on your turn. So yeah, I think this card is going to be pretty good. I think it's going to be played in some combo decks. I could even see playing it in some fair decks. Like, you know, the Time Walk decks tend to be blue-green, and I think that on average, Time Walk decks really like having more regrowths. So, yep, this one's sweet. I like it a lot. And then the next one I have, this is Frontline Rush. This is red-white for an instant. It says choose one. Create 2 1/1 red goblin tokens, or target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So tokens is like a very real part of the metagame, and this will just go in any tokens deck that can pay red-white. This is pretty easily the best Raise the Alarm they've ever printed, I think, unless you're going to count Orcish Bowmasters as a Raise the Alarm, which you could, but I don't think I would. This is when you want it to be creatures, it's great, but then if you draw it late when you're already pretty well developed on board, at a Raise the Alarm might be a little bit anemic, because like 2 more 1/1s would be like not that meaningful in the grand scheme of your board. Well, all of a sudden this turns into a thing that can help like speed up your clock, or maybe end the game out of nowhere. Yeah, not that much else to say about this card, to be honest. It's just a very good Raise the Alarm in the decks that can cast it. And maybe even in like non-tokens deck, like the tech decks, this one might be strong enough. Like, one of the things that the tokens deck does and has shown is that just making multiple bodies is very important for doing stuff like fighting over emblems, which is what a lot of the mid-range matchups tend to devolve into. So just having more ways of putting extra bodies on board, and extra bodies on the board kind of out of nowhere, I think is like quite nice. And yeah, Frontline Rush definitely a card that I'm interested in trying, and I'm sure will find its way into basically all the tokens deck. Okay, Roleplayers continued. The word roleplayer once again is doing some heavy lift. Is maybe a slight misnomer here. My categories are, they're okay. Look, all right, they're not perfect categories, but I wanted to get this out quickly, so I went for broad rather than extremely precise, because I think some of these cards are maybe a little better than Roleplayers, but I'm not sure they're good enough to be considered staples. So let's start with Ureni, the Song Unending. I put out a YouTube short about this one, by the way, if you want to go watch me talk about it again after I talk about it here. This is 5 red, green, blue for a 10/10 legendary creature spirit dragon. It has protection from white and black and flying. And then has the text, when Ureni enters, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers your opponents control, where X is the number of lands you control. You're not going to hardcast this card basically ever unless you're like really ramping aggressively, which tends not to be a playable thing to do. But the thing that I really like about this card is that I think it's a very good target for cheats. So it's especially good to natural order, but it's also probably fine to like polymorph into play or to reanimate. And the reason I like it in especially the natural order shells is this is a natural order target that is good when you are behind on board. Atraxa tends to be the fair natural order target that people reach for, and Atraxa is great, but you can end up in this situation, especially when you're playing these kind of elf decks that are low on interaction, where you like Eno for Atraxa, and then you just cross your fingers and hope it lives, because if they just have some way to remove it and you don't get value out of the lifelink, it's not really a stabilizing force for you, because you are unlikely to be finding like removal spells and stuff off of the tree. So it's worth noting, like, I think that most of the time Ureni is going to enter and X is going to be like maybe 4. 5 is probably great, like in Magical Christmas Land, or if in a game that's dragged really long, it's going to be 6 or 7. But like, I don't think you look at this card as something that's like Plague Wind. I think you look at this card as something that like is kind of like Flame Tongue Kavu. It comes into play, it's going to kill something, and then it's a 10/10 with really relevant protections, so it's going to be really hard to attack through, and it also ends the game turbo quickly. Like it attacks for just a ton of damage. So I think this card looks really sweet. I think it's going to be good. I could be wrong. It could just be that there's no room for another target, but I think this looks to be a really powerful natural order target. Dragonlord Atarka is the comparison for this one, which is from last time we were on Tarkir, I guess, or 2 times ago. Anyway, which was an 8/8 that dealt 5 damage divided up. But the issue that Dragonlord Atarka had was it didn't have any relevant protection, so it also would just die. And I think the protection keywords are pretty important here. Okay, so next we have Elspeth Stormslayer. The art actually partially covers the text. I wonder if that's the case in person too. I'm unsure. So this is a 5-mana planeswalker. It costs for 3 white. It's a legendary planeswalker, Elspeth. It has 5 loyalty when it enters. It has 3 abilities. It +1s to make a 1/1 white soldier. It's 0s to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain flying until end of turn. God, planeswalker text boxes are just so obscene. And then it -3s to destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or greater. So this would already be like a maybe, but probably too slow for like quote unquote modern Highlander. But then it also has static text, and the static text is, if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many tokens are created instead. So I guess Doubling Season just like needed to also have 3 text abilities, one of them being a removal spell, and needed to like self-power itself. So yeah, this card is really powerful. It does cost 5, and this will be a theme in the course of the review where there are some 5 drops, and I don't know. I think this one's definitely playable. Like, this card just does so much. It can come down and kill something if that's better for stabilizing the board. It can come down and immediately put 2 1/1s into play to protect itself if that's better to do. And if you untap with it and you have other token synergies in your deck, like, you know, it's just, it is a really, really terrifying permanent to have left in play, and it can keep itself in play pretty effectively. So yeah, this card is really high power level. Like, I don't know exactly what the decks look like that want to play it. Obviously, I feel like the token shells are probably pretty interested. Like, I think there's at least like the red-white based token shells are probably pretty interested in this one. In particular, like the one that is kind of Magical Christmas Landy is like you play this and then you like slam 4th Lingus next turn and 0 it, and you win the game on the spot. I mean, you're probably winning if you're playing 4th anyway, but there are definitely definitely some things that you can imagine with this card that go kind of wild. So yeah, I like this one a lot, and I think this is definitely a card that is going to win a lot of games. The 5 casting cost means that it's maybe a bit of a liability in matchups where your opponent has a counterspell or is playing counterspells, but also at the same time, they just don't have the counterspell. They might just die to this thing. I mean, it makes so much material. The static ability is terrifying. Yeah, very powerful card. Will be interesting to see how it ends up playing out. Okay, so next, I take it. Coffee. Okay, so next we have Sage of the Skies. This one is a little bit innocuous, I think. So Sage of the Skies is a 3 mana, 2/3. It has flying and lifelink. It casts for 2 and a white. And then it has this innocuous little text box. When you cast this spell, if you've cast another spell this turn, copy this spell, and the copy becomes a token. So, I have this in the Roleplayers section, and I think this card will kind of go under the radar for a little while. I think the magical Christmas land is you have Mana Crypt, and you go like turn 1, Mana Crypt this, and you put 4 power flying lifelink into play and over 2 bodies. And everyone can see that that's obviously very powerful. But even if you on, like, say, do it on turn 2 with a Mox, or if you are playing an elf deck and you go turn 1 elf, turn 2, play a 3-drop, turn 3, play another elf, play this. It's just pretty powerful to get that many stats for that little mana and to be able to divide them across multiple bodies. And I think the specific keywords are pretty high impact too. Lifelink is just like randomly very annoying because a lot of these kind of mid-range matchups end up coming down to a race to an extent. It is also another card that just like laughs in the face of the existence of mono red, like RIP mono red players. I'm sorry. Wizards seems intent on not allowing that deck to be playable, and this is yet another card that they're going to play this and you're going to like put your head in your hands because you can't beat it. And then flying also means that like this attacks through board stalls pretty well. It carries equipment really well. So yeah, this is one, you know, like I don't think that this is like a 10. It's probably not even an 8, but I think it's like, you know, a 6 or a 7 out of 10. And this is going to have high roll moments where it's going to really overperform, I think. And the nice thing about it is that the fail case is that it's a 3 mana 2/3 flying lifelinker. And that's not that bad. It's not good. Like that's, you would not just play one of those in modern Highlander, obviously. But I don't think that enabling the copying ability is going to be so hard that you're going to be doing it. You're going to be just casting this by itself all that often. Because very, very often the kinds of decks that are going to want to play this, like the aggro and mid-range decks, like those decks want a double spell anyway. That's kind of the whole point of how they often turn the corner, is that they double spell. It's also worth noting, like, the fact that it's not an ETB that makes the token, but actually it fully copies the spell, means that this plays well into counterspells as well. Like you play your elf, and then they're thinking like, oh, I'll counter the 3-drop, and then the 3-drop is secretly 2 spells, and they can only counter one of them. So yeah, it's good. I think it looks pretty interesting. I would expect to see it in decks, and it's definitely a card that I'm going to be trying to put in white decks. I'm going to try and make space for it. So yeah, pretty cool one. I'm a fan. Okay, so more role players. There's a lot. Interestingly, there's a lot of cards that I think are good enough to meet the role player level in this set. The first one is Anafenza Unyielding Lineage. So this is a 3 mana for 2 and a white. It's a legendary creature, Spirit Soldier. Has flash, first strike, and whenever another non-token creature you control dies, Anafenza endures 2, and she's a 2/2 to start. So endure, this is a new keyword, says you can either put X 1/1 counters on the creature that endured, where endure is like the number. So in this case, it would be 2. Or you can create a 2/2 white spirit token. Doesn't have flying, relevant. But yeah, this is interesting. You can obviously like set up situations where you know, make some attacks that are maybe a little weird and they block, and then you get to flash this in and grow it really quickly, or create a wider board, or you can just do it defensively. You play this after declaring blockers, and you get to, again, like rebuild your board quickly or build a large attacker. I think this card looks pretty good. Flash is a nice keyword. I think you basically always want to play it in a situation where you're going to get a trigger right away so that it becomes a 4/4, because the 2/2 stat line obviously is not good. But as soon as it gets one trigger and you're looking at like a 4/4 first striker for 3, that's a good card, I think. Like that's going to be really potent. So, yeah, I like this card. I think it'll be pretty good. I fully expect to get blown out by it at least once, where I like make some attacks and they block, flash this thing in, and then hit me for 8 on the crackback or something like that. That's going to happen, I think. The next one is another Endure creature. This is Warden of the Grove. This is 2 and a green for a 2/2 Hydra. And this says, at the beginning of your end step, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So it is kind of a 3/3. And then this says, whenever another non-token creature you control enters, it endures X, where X is the number of counters on this creature. So this is a card that is kind of kill on sight, right? If it comes into play, it becomes a 3/3 right away, so it can block as a 3/3. That's not amazing, but then it basically reads all of your creatures are at least one bigger, or you can create a pretty wide board pretty quickly. And especially if it lives a second turn and it starts letting you endure things for 2, I think that this is going to create some pretty unstoppable boards. And it doesn't ask you to do anything else. You don't need to find ways to put 1/1 counters on this thing. It just does it for you. I do think too, like Trent played like green-white counters matter deck somewhat recently on the channel for like a deck challenge, and that deck was fast and looked kind of real. And if you can cheat on putting counters on this thing, like either by having counter doublers like hardened scales or something, then this card gets out of hand fast. So I like this card. I think it's pretty interesting. I think that this is one that will find some homes, and I think you can also just play it in creature decks. I think it is just that good. So yeah, definitely a sweet one. I'm very intrigued. The next one we have is another green card. This is Surak, Elusive Hunter. So this is 2 and a green for a legendary creature, Human Warrior. This spell can't be countered. It has Trample. And then it has the text box, whenever a creature you control or a creature spell you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, draw a card. It's a 4/3. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. There are bears in the background and an elk, but there's an elephant in the room with this card, and people have definitely already pointed this out, but I will point this out as well. This card interacts unfavorably for you in the face of Orcish Bowmaster. So if you play this one, they Bowmasters it. What can happen is that they will just continue. So they Bowmasters targeting this thing, trigger goes on the stack, you draw a card from the trigger, Bowmasters re-triggers. Which means if they target this again, you draw another card. And this is a loop. And this is a loop that would deck you, because Surak's ability is not a May. Now, if you have literally any removal spell in your deck that can kill an Orcish Bowmasters, this loop goes until you draw one of those spells, or until you decide to stop the loop, I guess, technically. But if you like tap out for this on turn 3 and they Bowmasters you, and your deck like doesn't have like Solitude or like Gutshot, not that I'm advocating playing Gutshot, but maybe it's worth it if you're concerned about that. This can have a little oopsie doopsie, I decked myself effect. I don't think that that's enough of a reason to not play this card, but it is worth noting. I think you can't talk about this card without acknowledging that anti-sim. That being said, let's talk about the positive. So, can't be countered. I think that's a nice text to have. It's kind of free, and it is basically always going to draw a card. You know, you can, I guess maybe if it trades in combat, it's not going to, but if they ever point a spell at it, it's going to draw a card. And in particular, if you're playing like protection spells or other ways that you might save it, you might even be able to draw multiple cards. And it also protects all your creatures, which means that they are kind of incentivized to point something at this first. So it kind of double protects your creatures. One, it makes it so they don't want to target them because it will draw more cards. And two, it tends to tank the first removal spell, I think. The 3 toughness is a little concerning, and that I think will likely be the thing that keeps this down more than any potential I decked myself with Orcish Bowmasters kind of problems. But overall, I think this card is powerful enough that people are going to try it. This one I'm not like certain is going to be a long time format mainstay, but it's a cool card. And if there is some kind of like rug aggro deck, which I mean, I've got my Savage Knuckleblade ready if there is one, let's just say. I think this card obviously slots in there and is a very, very potent card in that shell. The next card I have is Mistrise Village. It's kind of funny because this card is like Teamer themed or Teamer identitied, and it is not an aggro card at all. This is such a combo card. So this is a land. It taps for blue. It enters tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest, and it has the text blue and tap is the cost, and the next spell you cast this turn can't be countered. Ugh. So this is like gonna be good in some number of combo decks for sure. Flash Hulk really likes this card, I think, because the Flash Hulk deck can set up these situations where if Flash resolves, it's so hard to fight through Flash Hulk once the Flash is resolved. The combo is so resilient now that like you're basically never gonna win if the Flash resolves. So this is obviously very good in those kinds of decks. Those decks play forests too, so this enters untapped like some amount of the time. And then I think the Academy decks like this as well. They just have extra mana lying around a lot of the time. And in a lot of instances, they have land tutors as well. So this card is probably good in those shells. Uncounterable Tinker for 5 mana, I think basically everyone would sign up for. And the thing that I think is interesting, this card is like kind of comparable to like Boseiju, who shelters all, which makes spells uncounterable if you use the mana to cast them. But the difference is this one just produces colored mana and can just kind of function as like a bad island if you really don't need the effect or can't afford the effect for a while. Whereas like Boseiju like costs life, makes colorless mana, like there's a lot of things about it that are problematic. So yeah, Mistrise Village I think is going to be a card that people reach for quite a lot in these kind of combo shells that either really care about resolving one spell or that have a lot of extra mana available to them. I don't think you're necessarily going to see it in like Storm, just because the Storm decks, like, I think resolving one spell does not always necessarily work. Maybe Breach. Maybe the Breach Storm decks want this, because if you resolve Breach, you're just like so likely to win the game in a lot of instances. So maybe. And the other nice thing about it is like it is recurable. So you can even just use it as a way to force through your tutors if you're playing into an opponent who's not presenting enough pressure. I don't know. It looks sweet. I think this card's really good. I don't think they're waiting to belabor the point all that much longer. Okay. Like I said, there's a lot of role players. I'm going to start speeding up a little bit on some of these because I don't want to... I value your time. I don't want to keep you here forever. But there are a lot of cards in the set that are pretty good. So let's start with Frostcliff Siege. I really like the theming on the sieges, by the way, that it's kind of like a battle between two clans in a particular area. So this is 1 blue-red for an enchantment. As this enchantment enters, you choose a side. You choose Jeskai or Teamer. The Jeskai side is whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. It's not quite Coastal Piracy, but it does just make it so that if you ever hit them, you get a card. And then the Teamer side, which I think is the side you'll choose slightly more often, is creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample and haste. And I think it's the haste keyword here that is really doing a lot of heavy lifting on this card. Haste is really like a powerful thing to just statically give to other cards. Wizards obviously like creates cards very deliberately around whether or not they get to attack the turn they enter play or not. And getting to break those rules means that you can potentially do some pretty gross things. And it's not nothing that this also gives trample and +1/+0. So like the turn you play it, even though you aren't necessarily getting a hasty creature down at the same time, you are probably at least building your board, making it a little bit bigger. And then it's nice too that in a case where maybe you're not in a position where you think that the trample and haste is meaningful, but you're maybe in a grindier game, you can choose Jeskai and make it so that all of your threats, even if you have like dorky little tokens or mana dorks that don't really matter, they start to mean more as attackers because letting anything through might, but turns through your deck, draws you more cards. So yeah, I like Frostcliff Siege a lot. I think this is the best of the sieges. I'm going to talk about a couple of them a little later on, but this one I think is my pick for number 1. Next we have Severance Priest. I don't know what's going on in the art here, but it is interesting for sure. So this is a 3 mana 3/3. It casts for Abzan mana, so white, black, green. It has Death Touch, and it says when this creature enters, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, exile that card. And then when this creature leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX white spirit creature token, where X is the mana value of the exiled card. So, this is obviously like not dissimilar from the 1 white 2/2 that exiles a creature on board and then they get a token back when it dies. But this takes cards out of hand. So let's talk about the positive first, and then I'll talk a little bit about reasons to be a little bit cautious about this card. When this enters, it gets rid of the thing forever. It's not that they get the card back. This isn't like this isn't like a Brain Maggot kind of effect, or Tidehollow Scholar. Like there's no getting your card back, or Mesmeric Fiend. That's the original. It's just gone. It's just exiled. So especially against some combo decks, that's like not quite game winning maybe, but it's very good to be able to just say, yeah, this thing doesn't exist in the game anymore. You now have to find a completely new way to win. And especially against the combo decks, this card is particularly good because even if they do kill it, it's unlikely that the token is a meaningful attacker for them. Like attacking for damage is unlikely to be the way that they're trying to win. So it's great in that regard. Really like that. Like if you tag like a Nadu out of a combo deck, Nadu is gone, and they just don't get to do that anymore. They're gonna win some other way. It has Death Touch, so it's like a meaningful attacker and blocker all the time, which is nice. Like even if you're playing into things that are going a little bit bigger, it still matters. And yeah, I think that those things are good. And then the other thing that is nice is that it says just non-land. So one of the issues with some of these effects in the past is like they've been like gate kept to instant sorcery, or they've maybe said creature, like you've got like Lifebane zombie or whatever. And this one just says basically just Thoughtseize them, exile it, and then if you take a really big thing and they kill this, and they might kill you with the token. But I don't think that downside is all that significant a lot of the time, to be totally honest. It is a little awkward that like if you wanted to do like flickering or like reanimating stuff with this card, you might be a little unhappy because you're giving them a board presence in exchange for exiling more cards out of their hand. But potentially that's still just fine. I'm not even certain it's bad. So yeah, this is definitely like the most pushed version of Sin Collector, like that kind of effect that we've ever seen. And I really like it. I think it looks really good. And I think this card is going to kill me a lot as a combo player. The next one we have here is Voice of Victory. This is 1 and a white for a human bard. The art is sick. The person in the art is playing like literal electric guitar, except it's not a guitar, obviously. I actually don't know what that instrument is inspired by, but very cool. This is a 1/3 with Mobilize 2. This is the first sighting of the Mobilize keyword. This says Mobilize 2 says when this creature attacks, create 2 tapped and attacking 1/1 red creature tokens, warrior creature tokens. You sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. And then your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. That's what this card says. So I think the silence is actually secretly the bonus text on this card. The silence effect, I think, is pretty good. The fact that you put this in play, and then all of a sudden on your turn you get to play with like relative impunity. That's already really nice. But the real reason this card is strong is that a 2-mana 3/3 is basically what this is, that creates a wide board. It's quite good in these mid-range matchups where you're fighting over emblems. It's nice. And if you get to like attack and make the 1/1s and they connect, it's worth noting they don't get sacked till the end step. So if you have something like Goblin Bombardment, or if you have like a Skull Clamp, anything of this ilk, these are usable pieces of material even after they deal damage in combat. So you get to kind of have your cake and eat it too. And I think that this card just has like a kind of confluence of good keywords, or not keywords, but a good text, and it's cheap enough that you're going to see play at a bunch of decks. Like I think Aristocrats decks are probably interested in this card for both effects, like getting the 1/1s is nice for them. And then I think like Tokens decks are interested in this card, and I could even just see like generic Skull Clamp mid-range decks playing this card because it just allows you to play your turns so differently. Like when you know you're not going to get removal spelled in combat, for example. It really sets up some tricky situations for your opponent. So yeah, I like Voice of Victory a lot. I think this is another one that's like a little innocuous, but is going to be very, very powerful. Next we have Strategic Betrayal. I don't know if this one's playable. Edicts have not been in high demand, especially because of how many random tokens are running around. This one is 1 and a black for target opponent exiles a creature they control and their graveyard. So the only reason I have this on the list is the exile effect. Exiling a creature is great. Having it gone forever, very nice. And the fact that you can just cast this to exile someone's graveyard is not a bad escape valve. I'm not sure this card is going to see play, to be honest. Maybe I have this card like rated a little bit too highly, but I don't know. It seems fine. I could see it being a card you reach for conditionally based on what your meta looks like. If exiling a graveyard as like a kind of splash hate effect is something that you really value, and there could definitely be metas where that would be the case, I think this card looks pretty good. Outside of that, you probably want to play Sheoldred's Edict instead. Oh my god, coffee's so good. Okay, so we're through the role player cards, and I think we are now officially in the cards that I have deemed good in one deck, or great in one deck. So these are the black aggro cards. These are cards that I think you'll play in exactly black aggro and basically nowhere else. Maybe some of them could see play in other shells, but I definitely envision these mostly as just like black mold or similar cards. The first is Rot Cursed Rakshasa. This is 1 and a black for a 5/5 trample. It does have Decayed, which means this creature can't block, and when it attacks, you sacrifice it at the end of combat. But then it has Renew, and this is kind of a neat keyword, for black X. So you pay that cost, you exile this card from your graveyard, and then you get to put a Decayed counter on each of X target creatures. I think this one looks kind of interesting. You get to attack for 5, which is something that I think the black aggro decks are interested in doing. And then in the long term, this is a card that kind of can sit in your graveyard, and you can use it as weird removal if you're racing, or it is kind of like a falter effect. Like you can just like make it so that 2 creatures can't block and you can get in for the win. I think that there's enough random things going on here that this card is playable. I could be wrong. The spots in the black aggro decks are increasingly competitive, so maybe none of these cards get in. But it looked sweet to me, so I figured I'd include it. The next one we have is Karsi Revenant. This is a 1 black flying Death Touch lifelink 3/3. Vampire Nighthawk is just in shambles looking at the cards that they print these days. I guess technically they still trade, so maybe Nighthawk's doing just fine. But yeah. So this one has all those keywords, and then additionally it has Renew, 2 and a black, exile this card from your graveyard, put a flying counter, death touch counter, and lifelink counter on target creatures. So you just get to turn a creature into a Vampire Nighthawk. Seems fine. I don't know. 1 black is a prohibitive casting cost, and this somewhat astonishingly might not be good enough for Highlander these days. But I thought it was worth including here. Very powerful, obviously in matchups where racing matters, but if you're not racing, I'm not as sure you're interested in paying 3 mana for this effect. It's probably pretty good, and I'm definitely like gonna try it in like, you know, black mold or something of that ilk. But yeah, I don't know. It might not be playable, which is kind of astonishing. This next one I think is playable. This is Sinkhole Surveyor. It's 1 and a black for a bird scout. It has flying, and whenever this creature attacks, you lose 1 life, and this creature endures 1. So this comes into play. It's a 1/3 on turn 1. On the first turn it's in play. Not amazing. But then the first time it attacks, it becomes a 2/4, or it makes a 1/1. Pretty good. And if this gets to attack like 2 or 3 times, it is turning into a threat that can get out of hand quite quickly. Flying is a really nice keyword for these black aggro decks. They do have equipment that they want to connect with, and so having things to hold equipment is nice. And this is just going to naturally grow or naturally build a board for you to do some attacking and blocking with. So I think Sinkhole Surveyor looks to be playable to me. Not like a 10 out of 10 by any means, obviously, but I think one that is worth playing. 2-drops are kind of hard to come by still, like premium 2-drops, like cards that you're really excited to play on turn 2. And I think this one does qualify. I think you're pretty excited to play this one on turn 2. Last in the list of black aggro cards for me is Avenger of the Fallen. So this is 2 and a black for a human warrior. It's a 2/4 with Death Touch. And then it has Mobilize X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So this is kind of a weird one where on turn 3, this is probably not attacking for a ton. But on like turn 4 or 5, if the game has gone a bit long, or like maybe you're doing things like casting Malevolent Rumbles, you could kind of easily envision a situation where this like is attacking and making 3 or 4 tokens at the same time. And again, like I said before, these are tokens that can be, used to Skull Clamp. They can be sacked to Goblin Bombardment. They can be used for all sorts of nefarious purposes. So I think this is a good black aggro card. This might be an Aristocrats card too. That's the other shell that this card kind of looks like it fits in. You could do something like play your Blood Artist, have a sack outlet, sack your board, attack, make a bunch more 1/1s, connect with those, sack those. So it does look good in that shell as well. So maybe I've mislabeled it by putting it in the black aggro cards section. But yeah, definitely an interesting one. I think you're gonna see this card see play. I'm definitely gonna have it come into play and die to it at some point for sure. This is definitely one where when it's good, when the Mobilize X is secretly Mobilize 5, you're gonna like you're gonna be dead. But the downside is that like when it's Mobilize 0, a 3-mana 2/4 Death Touch is not a card that. Okay, I have titled this slide Jeskai cards that don't go in Jeskai because you will note all of these cards have literal Jeskai in their mana cost, and I don't think a single one of them goes in the de facto Jeskai deck that people play. But I think they're good, and I think maybe there's a different Jeskai deck that you play them in. So we'll start with Shiko, Paragon of the Way, or maybe Shiko. I actually don't know. Probably Shiko, yeah. This is a 5-mana Spirit Dragon legendary creature. It casts for 2 and then Jeskai, so blue, red, white. It has flying and vigilance. It's a 4/5, like I mentioned. And when it enters, exile target non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, copy it, and then you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So this is a sweet effect. It is basically 5 mana ETB, cast a cheapish thing from your graveyard for free. And the thing is anything. Could be an enchantment, could be a creature, doesn't have to be an instant or sorcery, which is typically how these cards are templated. Magical Christmas Land is like this comes into play and it casts like Time Walk or Ancestral Recall or something of that ilk. But even if this just comes into play and like recasts a creature, I think you're pretty happy. So yeah, I think this card looks sweet. It does cost 5, which is obviously concerning. But I don't know. It looks pretty good to me, and I am intrigued. Let's just say. I will tell you of the deck that I'm envisioning. Maybe as we get through these cards, the next one will more clearly kind of elucidate what I'm going for. But I do think that there's a kind of interesting shell that you could try to put this in. The next card that we have is Flamehold Grappler. This is a 3-mana 3/3 with First Strike. It's a creature, human monk. It casts for Jeskai, so blue, red, white. And this creature says, when this creature enters, copy the next spell you cast this turn. When you cast it, you may choose new targets for the copy. So this basically like comes into play, and then it lets you uh, lets you copy a spell. So this one's like kind of interesting. It unfortunately I think doesn't work with like Twin Flame the way that Dualcaster Mage does, um, which is a shame because this copies the spell when you cast it, not on ETB. If that was the case, then I think you would have a real cool shell. But even just copying something else, I think is pretty interesting. Obviously, again, Magical Christmas Land is like you play this, you play Recall, but even just going like on 4 mana, like play this, play Lightning Bolt, is pretty good. Or play any other removal spell or cantrip is already pretty good. And 3 mana, the first strike is pretty impactful. I think going to help it actually compete in combat. Again, I don't think this card's incredible. I don't think this card gets into regular Jeskai, but I kind of think there might be some sort of like Jeskai prowess deck that's going bigger than the blue-red prowess deck is. Like the blue-red prowess deck is very aggro focused and it's trying to like win the game on turn 4. And I kind of think there might be a mid-range approach that you can take with those cards. And these are both ones that I think would fit into that shell that I have in mind. I'm thinking something where you're like, your points are like time walks, maybe like time walk, a mox, and like mystical tutor. And you're doing stuff like this where you're putting into play like Shiko and Flamehold grapplers, and you're like copying your time walk, copying your other like cheaper spells. You play like some of the prowess threats, and then like also some of like the growers, like Sprite Dragon. You play like obviously like the big creatures that like care about the number of instants and sorceries in graveyards and exile. I don't know. I'm cooking. I'll probably put it together and play it once the set comes out on Magic Online. But the other two cards that I have here also I think would go in this deck. So the next one is Narset Jeskai Waymaster. This is a 3-mana 3/4. Again, it casts for Jeskai. It's a legendary creature, human monk. At the beginning of your end step, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw cards equal to the number of spells you've cast this turn. This is the one that I'm the least certain is good. But I will say that if you get into like a low resource situation, this card does just potentially read like draw a card every turn. Or if you do something like you get to go like cantrip into spell and then you're empty handed and then you draw 2 cards on your end step. Like that's quite powerful. Obviously, it's a legend with no ETB, which Caracas is a little annoying, obviously. But I do think that the effect here is non-insignificant. And then this is the kind of thing that if it sits in play for a turn or two in a mid-range mirror, could really bury your opponent. And if you're playing against like a more like combo deck and your hand is blanks against what they're doing, and you like don't really have that much going on, you maybe aren't unhappy discarding 3 cards to draw 2 if you're turning 3 blanks into potential hits, right? So I don't know. I think this card has potential. I don't think you can look at it as a card that's going to draw 5 cards on a turn. That's too Magical Christmas Landy. But I think what you kind of look at it as is, okay, I'm going to plan to play a deck where I am going to be, shooting out a lot of cards kind of quickly. And maybe this is a thing that lets me sustain a little bit longer. So yeah, Narset Jeskai Waymaster, pretty cool. I'm interested. Definitely goes in this deck that I'm envisioning. The last one, this is from the Commander deck. This is Elsha Threefold Master. Again, this is a card that casts for Jeskai. The legendary creature Jin Monk has Trample, Prowess, and a very cool text box. It says, whenever Elsha deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 Monk creature tokens with Prowess. Now, cool text box. Trample is cool. Prowess is sweet. This is a 1/1. And I cannot understate how, or I really don't want to understate how big of a problem a 3-mana 1/1 is potentially. You could just want to die after you play this if it gets like Bowmastered or something like that, or if you don't have spells in hand and you top deck this and you're like staring down a board of, like Ocelot Pride tokens, and you just feel like this is never going to get in. There are obviously low roll situations for this card, but I think the way you have to look at this card is, man, if you play this on turn 3 and then on turn 4, like it lives, and then on turn 4 you get to go like play 1 or 2 spells that clear the way for it, and you hit for 3 and make 3 1/1 Prowess monks. That's quite good. Is this card better or worse than something say like Monastery Mentor? I don't know. The other thing to keep in mind with Elsha is like if you do something like brute force this thing to pump its power, you're getting a bunch more monks. So you can like convert a brute force into like more long-term power. I know Jer's really excited about this card too. When we were talking about it in one of our Discord chats, he was sort of like, yeah, I look forward to killing people with this card. So I'm definitely interested in trying this one. Of these 4 cards I have on the list, the other 3 I think are going to stay in that kind of Jeskai prowess deck that I'm brewing up in my head. This one is going to start in the deck. Certainly going to try it. I could see myself cutting it because at the end of the day, it is the 3-mana 1/1, and that stat line is really bad. But we'll see. There are definitely things that you can do to make it less bad, and I'm not certain that that's going to be enough. One other card that I don't have here on this list, but maybe I should talk about quickly. They printed, it's not anywhere in the presentation, I just thought of it. They printed a 4-mana Storm Ethereal Armor. It's like 3 and a white, and it's an enchantment with Storm that's just Ethereal Armor. It gives +1/+1. I think it gives First Strike for every enchantment you control. I don't know if I'm going to play that in this deck, but that it also comes from this Jeskai Commander deck. I do think that card's really cool. I love that they're still trying to find ways to print Storm on cards, and yeah, maybe I would try that in this deck too. Sorry, that was just a random aside, but I think that card's cool. Okay, the next one, Mardu tokens cards. That would be great if you delete Karakas. Ignore that this isn't a legend. So one of the people who I've talked with a bunch about previews during spoiler season is Jason, who you may well know is a very well-known Mardu tokens enjoyer, the, I would argue, creator of the deck, and someone who has won a lot of YJ tournaments with it. And he actually doesn't like any of these cards, even though I was like, man, these are like slam dunk, awesome Mardu tokens cards. He was like, 3-mana legend with no ETB. So it's bad into Karakas. So I'm going to talk about them. I will say that the master thinks they're bad, like the person who's played the deck the most, I would say, and as a result has pretty good opinions, you would think. Doesn't think that they're necessarily good, but I'm going to talk about why I think they might be good, and you can make yourself. So the first one we have is Zurgo Stormrender. This is the 3-mana 3/3. It casts for red, white, black, so Mardu. A legendary creature, Orc Warrior, with Mobilize 1, and whenever a creature token you control leaves the battlefield, draw a card if it was attacking, otherwise each opponent loses 1 life. So what this means is that your Mobilize cards get juiced. They're way better. If the cards make it to the end step, then your opponent's getting drained for 1 more, which means that they're getting clocked pretty quickly. And if your opponent chooses to block the 1/1s because they have like favorable blocks, you're going to draw cards. So this basically like kind of gives your 1/1s unblockable. And to me, this looks pretty powerful. I don't know. I guess I'll have to see just how negative the 3 toughness and the being a legend with no ETB is, but this one looks quite good to me. Similarly, the other Zurgo Thunder's Decree, which is a 3-mana 2/4 that casts from Mardu, red, white, black. It has Mobilize 2, and it says, during your end step, warrior tokens you control have this token can't be sacrificed. Amusingly, it's like maybe a slight anti-synergy with the other Zurgo, I'm not sure. So this one just basically makes it so that all your Mobilize cards don't actually sacrifice their warriors. And it's worth noting, the warriors only try to get sacked once. So as long as they survive their first end step, they won't try to sacrifice themselves again in the next one. So this is like a 2-mana 4/4 that attacks, or 2-mana 2/4 that attacks as a 4/4 and really quickly gets out of hand. I mean, it attacks for 4 on the first turn, 6 on the next turn, 8 on the turn after. To me, this feels like it's kind of must kill. Again, I guess it gets Karakas, but I just don't know how often that's going to happen. But yeah, sweet card. I'm gonna try both of these in tokens, and maybe they're not gonna be good, but I'm kind of hoping they will. I'm gonna skip Mardu Siegebreaker just because it doesn't fit the theme of cards I'm talking about. I'm gonna talk about Nariv Crackling Vanguard first. So this is 2 red, white, black for a legendary Spirit Dragon. It's a 4/4 with Flying Death Touch. When Nariv enters, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. And then whenever it attacks, exile a number of cards from the top of your library equals the number of differently named tokens you control. During any turn you attacked with a commander, you may play these cards. This card is so close to being playable. And I think it's such a shame that they templated it as during any turn you attacked with a commander instead of during any turn you attacked with Nariv. This one I think is definitely not playable because of that templating, unfortunately. But it's so close. It's so close to being so cool. As is, like, it's basically a 5-mana 6/6 with some of the power spread across multiple bodies. But because that last text box isn't a real text box, I unfortunately think you're not allowed to play. A card I do think you're allowed to play is Mardu Siegebreaker. This is the last one I have on this slide. So this is 1 red, white, black, so 4 mana for a 4/4 with Death Touch and Haste. This card says whenever this creature enters, exile up to 1 target creature you control until this creature leaves the battlefield. So you basically put this into play, get rid of something, and it will come back. So you don't have to sacrifice it forever. You just have to put it on layaway, essentially. And then whenever this creature attacks, for each opponent, create a tapped token that's a copy of the exiled card that's attacking that opponent. And then at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice those tokens. So I think this is potentially pretty good, especially because it has haste. You can kind of envision a situation where this comes down, it creates a copy of something with a reasonable ETB, and then you just get that ETB every turn. Like, Magical Christmas Land is probably something like White Plume Adventurer. You get to go like White Plume into play this, eat my own White Plume, and then just you get to take the initiative twice every turn. Like, you're double venturing into the Undercity, which seems very good. But there are other things that would probably be pretty reasonable for this as well. I mean, I haven't thought about the exact specifics of everything but there are definitely some options, let's just say. A Johnny Nakatl Pariah is a kind of interesting one. I wonder how that interaction works. I'm not even sure whether you get a token flipped Planeswalker or not. But even if you didn't, you'd be making an extra token every ETB, something like that. There are certainly cards that are pretty happy to get chomped up by this and then spit out again every turn. And the nice thing is you eventually get them back. Like, if this dies, you do get whatever's stuck underneath it back. So really interesting card. It does cost 4, but I think this one actually is maybe a sleeper. The casting cost, like, we don't have a lot of Mardu decks that aren't the tokens deck in the Highlander format, but the tokens deck, to be fair, actually like plays a decent number of cards that have good ETBs as well. So it's not as though this has no targets in the decks either. I guess one other thing that's noteworthy specifically for the Mardu tokens context, this is a human, so it gets pulled out by Winota, which is a thing that deck is doing. Interesting detail. I don't know if it's good, but it's an interesting detail at least. I've titled this slide, these are lands cards, I guess. I don't play a lot of lands, so I'm not super adept at analyzing and card evaluating them. The first one I think is definitely pretty good. So this is Glacierwood Siege. This is 1 green-blue for a enchantment. You choose a side. You choose either Temur or Sultai. I think you are going to choose Sultai basically every time. Temur says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, target player mills 4 cards. Sultai says you may play lands from your graveyard. So this is like another Crucible effect. I think that the land stacks sort of will take as many of these as my understanding. The art for this card is like 10 out of 10. Super cool, by the way. I really like it. But yeah, I think that this is just Crucible number 4 or whatever it is, and that's just an effect that the land stacks probably want. The next one, this is Taval, the Balanced Scale. This is 1 black, green, blue for a legendary Spirit Dragon. It's a 4/4 flyer, and when it attacks, you mill 3 cards. You then return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And whenever one or more lands, or whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie druid. Very cool keyword. I don't think this goes in druids, unfortunately, but it does make them. I don't know that this one's playable necessarily, but the fact that it gets back any land is not irrelevant. It comes back tapped, which is a little unfortunate, but this is kind of like an army in a can. Worth noting too that like if you put this in play and then you like delve or you like dredge life from the loam, those are all things that will trigger the token creation. So you can go kind of crazy and make a bunch of tokens pretty quickly. Next we have Awaken the Honored Dead. This is a 3-mana saga. It casts for Sultai, black, green, blue. Chapter 1 is destroy target non-land permanent, which is why this is playable, I think, because the very worst fail case is just 3-mana kill anything, which is like, it's playable, I think, probably. And then Chapter 2 is mill 3 cards, not exciting, but it is what it is. And then Chapter 3 is you may discard a card. When you do, return target creature or land from your graveyard to your hands. Kind of trade a card in hand for a card in graveyard. I think in the land stacks in particular, there are just going to be spots where you want to trade random card in your hand for a specific land you really need, or like maybe Strip Mine Wasteland kind of situation. But the fact that on the front half, this is just not quite Vindicate, but it is just like a Maelstrom Pulse effect means that you're willing to play this card, I think, probably. We'll see. It's just nice to get like a little bit of extra value. Maybe it's not good, but I think it's kind of interesting. And also, like, these are decks that care about Delirium, and this is like an enchantment that is also a removal spell, so kind of interesting. There are more tokens cards, astonishingly. So the first one is Windcrag Siege. This is 1 red-white for an enchantment. You choose either Mardu or Jeskai. The Mardu side is not very good. Mardu is if a creature attacking causes a triggered ability or of a permanent you control to trigger, you can trigger it at an additional time. So this means like things that say when you attack get doubled. Some of those effects are pretty good, but there's not really a density of them, I think, to make that reliable yet. But the Jeskai side says at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 goblin creature token. It gains lifelink and haste until end of turn. So this is just like another engine. I don't know if this is good enough. It might well not be. But the goblins stick around and they don't have to attack or anything, so you can just use this to like build up a wide board progressively. It looks kind of interesting. Another kind of interesting one is from the commander set. This is Will of the Mardu. This is 2 and a white for an instant. It says choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast a spell, choose both. Not relevant for us. So this one either creates a number of 1/1 red creature tokens equal to the number of creatures target player controls. You can target yourself. Or Will of the Mardu deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures you control. So if you are behind and they are beating you on board, you can use this to make a bunch of 1/1s to at least match their board size. Not terrible. And if you're ahead, you can either double the size of your own board, or you can use this as a removal. I think this is playable. I don't know. 3 mana is like a bit of a weird spot, but this looks pretty interesting to me. Especially when you're fighting like emblem battles and stuff. This seems like a card that would be good for that. It either takes out like a problematic flyer or something that's going to take the emblem away, or it just makes enough creatures that you're like relatively guaranteed to get the emblem. The next one we have is Inox Strike Leader. It's a dog warrior. It's a 1 and a white for a 2/2. It says whenever you attack with this creature and or your commander, again for us, for each opponent, create a 1/1 goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking that player, and then you can sack this creature to give creature tokens you control indestructible until end of turn. So this one's kind of nice that in the sense that it is just creating more bodies. This one has like pseudo mobilize, but it's slightly better, and it makes goblins. And then it also has this ability to protect the rest of your tokens. I think this one, if it is playable, it's playable because it costs 2. I'm not convinced that this one is like the stones or anything like that, but I don't know. I think this one looks interesting at the very least. It's going to allow you to potentially generate a wide board if you're like removing your opponent's threats. It attacks for like 3, then 5, 7. So like it ramps up pretty quickly if you're able to kind of interact with what your opponent's doing, or if you do something like put a flowering of the white tree, the Lord of the Rings Anthem card. Anyway, if you put that one in play, the creature tokens obviously get enhanced, to say the least, and so stuff like that makes this an interesting effect, I think. Interestingly, it works with the Mardu side of Windcrag Siege if that's something you were so inclined to do, but as I said, I'm not sure I would be. The last card I have in the tokens category is Fellothar, Dawn of the Abzan. This is an Abzan card. It casts for white, black, green. It's a 3/3 trample. It's a legendary human warrior. This says when it enters or attacks, you may sacrifice a non-land permanent. When you do, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So if you're going wide, this is a way that lets you convert like kind of meaningless 1/1s into a lot of pressure potentially. It is also worth noting that this is allowed to sack itself. So if you are in a situation where you just need all of your attackers this turn, you have nothing else, no other material, you can just play this as 3 mana, give all my creatures +1/+1 counter. Pretty good. In that kind of like counters matter deck I was talking and thinking about, this looks like it would be pretty good. Like if you have, you can kind of imagine if you have something like a Hardened Scales in play and you go you go play this thing, sack meaningless map token, or even like a 1/1 creature token or something like that, give everything +2 plus like 2/+1/+1 counters, like that's gonna kill people. So it's a sweet one. I think this looks pretty powerful. The cost is not 0. You have to have stuff to sack, but you often will, I think, and especially if you're creating a bunch of tokens, you may well be willing to trade off one token for the betterment of the rest of your board. Okay. Ooh, I forgot to update the arts on these ones. These ones, the arts look a little bit foggy, sorry. We're into the I'm definitely going to die to these cards category. So I'm going to go through these a little bit faster because I don't necessarily see the shell for these right away, but I'm fairly convinced that either I or someone else is going to cast this against me and I'm going to die. So Afterlife from the Loam, great name, love the reference, is 5 black, black, black. It's a sorcery with Delve. Delve means that you can exile cards from your graveyard to reduce the cost. So this can cost as little as 3 black. And then it says for each player, choose up to 1 creature card in that player's graveyard. Put those into battlefield under your control. They're zombies in addition to their other types. So 3 mana for a reanimate is a good rate. That is a rate that we are willing to pay in Highlander. The fact you need 5 other cards in the yard is not nothing, but it's typically a cost you can pay. And the fact that you get the bonus of stealing something from their graveyard is nice as well. I'm going to be the one killing people with this card. I'm kind of hoping. This is just another one to add to the reanimation suite. It like goes into Tin Fins, it goes into Reanimator. It's just playable. Triple black sucks a bit. Needing to have Delve fodder means that this card's not like broken or anything, but it's good. I think this card's playable. Next we have Cottis, Sibsig Champion. This is a 3/3 that casts for black, green, blue, so Sultai. It says once during each of your turns, you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard by exiling 3 other cards from your graveyard in addition to paying its other costs. And then it says when 1 or more creatures you control enter, if 1 or more of them entered from a graveyard or was cast from a graveyard, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Cottis. This thing could get so big, so fast, and it's not even that hard. So I'm interested in this card. I don't know like what the shell looks like, but like blue-green self-mill, or even just maybe you're playing like some kind of like a Sultai mid-range deck that's leveraging some more graveyard synergies. I just think that there's like a world where it's also self-fueling, right? Because it lets you cast a creature from your graveyard, so it can trigger itself once a turn anyway. So as long as you can like keep the fuel in the graveyard, like this card could get really big really fast. Now, it is a 3 mana legend with no ETB, so that's a problem. But if it gets going, as you can see in the title, you're definitely going to die to this card, although I don't think it's like incredible or anything. A Diviner of Mist. This is a 5 mana, 4 and a blue dragon with flying. It's a 4/5, and it says when this creature attacks, mill 4 cards. You may cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard with mana value 4 or less without paying its mana cost. If that spell will be put into your graveyard, exile instead. So, worth noting, this doesn't have to cast the spell from the 4 cards you milled. It's just any spell in your graveyard. That seems pretty good. This is a 5 mana creature. Those are often not especially playable, but this text box is really something. Like in terms of a grindy matchup, this card grinds like crazy. So I do like that aspect of it. If you could like find some way, like if you could Arena of Glory this card, I think you would be really happy. And I really like that it fuels itself, like it's self-milling you, so you don't even necessarily need to be casting spells really aggressively. Yeah, I like this one. I think I like this one in like blue-red though, not in Sultai, which is what the commander deck that it comes from is the Sultai commander deck. But like some kind of like blue-red shell where you maybe could give this haste, somehow, or you know, this is maybe casting like more impactful removal spells. I don't know. It costs 5. The bar for 5 drops is really high, but this is a really powerful effect. Maybe this is one that you could fit into that like kind of blue-green Simic Slaw mid-range style deck as well. That might be something that they would be interested in as well. The last one in this list is Colossal Grave Reaver. This is a 6 and green black dragon. It's a 7/6. It costs 8 mana as flying. Whenever this creature attacks or enters or attacks, mill 3 cards. And then it says when 1 or more creatures are put into your graveyard from your library, put 1 of them onto the battlefield. So, is this a good reanimation target? I don't know. I'm not convinced it is, but holy, like this text box is absurd. And so this is why I feel like I'm definitely going to die to this card, because someone's going to put it in play, and then like if you cast Entomb, you just get to, Entomb reads 1 black, put a creature in play, like put your Emrakul in play, put your Atraxa in play, or, you know, even if you're just playing this in a slightly more like value reanimator deck, like every time you mill, you're potentially putting another creature in play. You do need to reanimate it. That's like the only reasonable way that you can get this into play. And if you're planning to reanimate things, there are better things to reanimate than this, because this doesn't win the game on its own. It merely like lets you win the game after you do some more stuff once this is in play. But card is really cool, and it's definitely gonna kill people. I've titled this slide combo cards. So these are all just like cards I think might go into combo decks of varying types. The first one is Aligned Heart. This one goes in my Jeskai big range prowess deck too. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment that has Flurry. So Flurry is a new keyword from this set. They finally keyworded when you cast your second spell. That's what it is. So Flurry is whenever you cast your second spell, do something. So this one says Flurry. Whenever you cast your second spell, put a rally counter on this enchantment. Then create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess for each rally counter on this. So this makes 1 monk, then 2 monks, then 3 monks, then 4 monks. Maybe this isn't a combo card so much as it is like maybe more of a mid-range card, but this is one where if you put this in play and then you're just kind of churning, it definitely has the potential to create a really wide board and a really high impact board. So I like this one. I'm unconvinced if it's like absurd or anything like that, but I do think it's pretty good. Man, doing this video in one take was a bold call on my part. The next one we have is Will of the Jeskai, another one of the wills. This one is 3 and a red. It lets you cast it for both halves if you have your commander. We won't ever. This one, you have 2 options. You can either each player may discard their hand and draw 5 cards, or each instant and sorcery in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana. So this is like Past in Flames, bad Wheel of Fortune split card. And there are probably some Storm decks that are interested in that split card. Maybe High Tide with the Red Splash wants this card. The fact that it's only instants and sorceries means that, like, I don't think that regular Storm is interested in this card necessarily, but, like, the kinds of decks that are, like, making a lot of mana and then, like, spinning wheels and stuff like that, like this, because it is either gas in the sense that you can, like, get new cards if you've got nothing going on, or it is a way to potentially just win the game if you have something deterministic in your graveyard. So yeah, I like this one. It's very versatile. I'm not certain it's going to be this like huge format all-star or anything like that, but it seems playable in certain shells. Speaking of Storm cards, this is Stormscale Scion, my favorite card from the set, I think. So this is 4 red. It's a dragon. It's a 4/4. It has flying. It says other dragons you control get +1/+1. And then it has Storm. So it's interesting. They printed a card similar to this, I think, in Outlaws of Thunder Junction in the like special edition slot or something like that, that made 4/4. Were they dragons or were they elementals? Anyway, it was 6 mana, Storm, make 4/4s. And now this is similar. This is a creature. And one thing that I've kind of been keeping an eye on, they do just keep printing more of these lower cost Storm payoffs that don't require you to actually have a super high Storm count necessarily to have it be really high impact. Um, for example, like with Stormscale Dragon, if you cast this with like Storm 3, like if you just on your turn go Ritual, Stormscale Scion, that's putting 18 power in play. Now it's on creatures that can interact with creatures, sure thing, that's fine. But like if you do it for 4, like if you have like, you know, cantrip, ritual, Stormscale Scion, like that's 28 power. That's 4 7/7s. And obviously each time one dies, they all get weaker. So, you know, you lose the power somewhat rapidly. But this card seems pretty good to me. I don't know. I'm like kind of interested in trying to make something like this work. And I think that it's probably bad, but this is one to keep an eye on. Like as they keep printing more of these lower storm count payoffs, like Tendrils needs 10. This needs like 3 or 4. Dragonstorm needs like 2. Dragonstorm, a pet deck of mine, if you weren't aware. I haven't been able to make it work for a while, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that there is a lot to be said about that and about keeping an eye on that as it kind of goes on. It would be really nice if you could find a way to give these haste. That would really kind of slam the door on this being like just like an actively very good card. Or if you could do something like put Terror of the Peaks into play and then start storming off with Stormscale Scion, obviously you'd be really happy to. But yeah, I kind of think that this is one that's worth keeping an eye on. I'm going to try and play it anyway. I think you could even just put it in like a Big Idiot Dragon shell where you're just playing like mana rocks and dragons, because even if you cast it like Storm 2 and you make 2, but you have other dragons that care about the Anthem effect, I think that it's still very good. Okay, next we've got United Battlefront. This is 3 and a white. It's a sorcery that says look at the top 7 cards of your library, put up to 2 non-creature, non-land permanent cards with mana 3 value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay, so this is like a combo card in the sense that it's good at finding like multiple pieces. I could see this in like an Academy style shell. It's just good at getting material in play. It doesn't really hit things that you're super excited about, so I'm not convinced this card is incredible. But I do think that there are probably decks that are potentially interested in this type of effect. I don't have that many thoughts about it. I haven't personally thought of the Magical Christmas Land scenario where this card is good. I guess the really obvious one is this puts like Time Vault and Voltaic Servant in play and you win the game. And maybe Time Vault is a shell that would play this. That is a deck that just plays a bunch of random artifacts as well. So like most of the time this is going to put stuff in play. That deck plays Oko and like Baby Teferi as well, which this can put into play. Okay, yeah. I've talked myself into it. I'll play this in Time Vault. That's the shell I want to play it in. But I think it's kind of interesting. I definitely wouldn't be shocked for it to see play. And this, I think we are still in the these cards are gonna kill me category. Okay, we are really well and truly hitting the like these cards are gonna kill me, but I'm not certain they're there yet. So we'll go through these a little faster. This is Eshki, Teemer's Roar. This is a 2 mana, 3 mana 2/2 that casts for green, blue, red. The Human Warrior, legendary creature. When you cast a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Eshki. If that spell's power was 4 or greater, draw a card. If that spell's power was 6 or greater, Eshki deals damage equal to Eshki's power to each opponent. This is like an engine card. It grows somewhat quickly. It's going to die a little too easily, I think, which is why it's in the category of I'm going to die to this card, because sometimes you're not going to have the removal spell and this is going to like run roughshod over you. But on average, I think this one's probably not quite good enough, but it's very cool and it's very high power level. So I thought it was worth talking about. Next, we have Eshki Dragon Claw. This is the one from the mainline set. So this is 1 green, blue, red for a legendary creature, Human Warrior. It's a 4/4 with Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 1, which is a pretty relevant keyword these days for your 4-drops. This one says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast both a creature and non-creature spell, draw a card and put 2 1/1 counters on Eshki. Not the easiest criteria to meet, but if you can meet it once, it's already very good. Drawing an extra card and making this a 6/6, obviously quite good. So I think this one is actually maybe better than the other Eshki. Yeah, I think if you can get this to trigger once, and like you could get that to trigger by going like mana dork, removal spell, attack, draw a card, put 2 counters on this thing. Like it's not outrageously outside the realm of possibility. It's just like once you've already gotten to 4 mana, like sometimes your hand is like a little bit depleted. So I'm not fully convinced that this is going to trigger all the time. But if it does trigger, obviously it's going to be quite strong, worth trying. I think this one fits into that like teamer kind of aggro mid-range deck that I was thinking about. Okay, Will of the Abzan. This is 3 and a black for a sorcery. It's another modal card. Option 1 is your opponent sacks the biggest creature they control and they lose 3 life. Option 2 is Zombify. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Zombify, 4 mana has typically been 1 mana too far in Highlander to pay for your reanimate effects. The only reason I think this one is like a maybe is because the other half of it is removal spell, which I think maybe pushes it into the realm of like you're allowed to do this, but probably not good enough. But I could see people playing it if you wanted to have a slightly more modular reanimator card. Transcendent Dragon. This is 4 blue for a flash flying dragon. It's a 4/3, and it says when this spell enters, if you cast it, counter target spell. That spell is countered this way, and exile it instead of putting it into the owner's graveyard. Then you may cast it without paying its mana cost. I'm gonna get blown out by this card at some point. Some maniac, the maniac is me. I'm gonna put this in my deck, but someone else is gonna do it too, and I'm gonna get some 4-drop countered where they're just gonna get a flash flying 4/3 and also the 4-drop I played. This card costs 6. 6-drops are basically uncastable these days, unfortunately. I think that you are going to have a really hard time finding a spot for this card, but man, is the text box cool. This one and Calidus Assassin is another card that I really like, are like cards where I'm like, I really wish these were cards I could still play in this format. Maybe in like the blue-green Simic Slaw deck, maybe that deck would be interested in like being able to just pass on 6 and have something that would be defensive but also advance their board. I could see it, but that's the only kind of shell that I could see the card being played. Okay, yeah, so we have hit the point in the video where I'm talking about real bottom of the barrel ones here. So new way forward. This is 2 blue, red, white for an instant. This card is going to kill me, by the way. Like 100%, someone's going to cast this and kill me. This one says the next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. Then when the damage is prevented, deal that much damage to the source's controller and you draw that many cards. So like Magical Christmas Land, they try and price of progress you and you get to like deal them 8 and draw 8 cards. I don't know if this card's good. I've been playing Ink Shield, which is a card from, I believe it's from the, what set is it from? It's from the Wizard set, whatever that one is. The one with houses. Oh my god. Killing me that I can't remember. Anyway, that's the one. That one says prevent all damage, make 2/1 flying tokens for each damage prevented that way. That costs 5 as well. That card is a beating when you get to resolve it. I think this card is kind of similar in the sense that like if you get to resolve this in a way where you're drawing 3 or 4 or 5 cards and maybe like preventing a lethal attack or preventing an attack that would have chunked you, it's good. But this card is like, it costs 5. Like I'm excited about this card and I'm definitely going to die to it at some point or I'm going to kill someone with it, but I don't think it's good. I would not advocate putting it in your decks. Hallowmerk Siege. This card might be a little low, honestly. Maybe this one was supposed to be higher up. This one is green-black for a enchantment. This is the battle between Sultai and Abzan. So you can choose Sultai, which is when a counter is put on a creature you control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Not bad. And then Abzan, when you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains menace until end of turn, which I think is probably the one that you're more interested in. And in the kind of like +1/+1 counters matter deck that I think might very well be playable, this effect looks pretty good. And honestly, either half of this effect looks pretty good. So yeah, I probably have this card a little low because the other cards on this list are like, marginal. Whereas like, I think in that deck, you're quite excited to play this card. Overall, just like paying 2 mana and every turn getting to grow a creature and give it menace. might be playable. Spending your turn 2 doing that doesn't sound like something you want to do, but maybe in a situation where you go like elf into 3-drop on turns 1 and 2, on turn 3 being able to go like 2-drop and this, maybe that's something you're interested in. I don't know. Could be pretty good. Then we have Magmatic Hellkite. This is 2 red for a flying dragon. It is a 4/5, and it says when this creature enters, destroy target non-land an opponent controls. Non-basic land an opponent controls. Its controller searches their library for a basic land, puts it on the battlefield tapped with a stun counter, and then shuffles. So it's the stun counter that makes this card interesting, I think. Basically, this is like not quite a land destruction spell, but it does set them back. The next turn they're going to be -1 land, and this does let you take out either like a problem utility land, or if you're playing in a metagame where people are being kind of greedy with their mana bases, this allows you to potentially get people. This is a card that I think fits in like Big Red. I could definitely see Big Red being interested in a card like this effect. This effect definitely fits in like Rakdos Big Idiot Dragons, something like that. Like, this is a strong card. I don't know how strong, whether it's strong enough to see play like outside of shells like that, but I think this is like a decent medium red card. It's definitely annoying, like getting your land blown up and then temporarily not even getting to use the basic you fetched. That's going to disrupt your plan if that happens, I think, at a non-zero amount of the time. So I could definitely see this card being impactful, and you know, if you ever get to like start flickering it or something, maybe you go wild and you get to take out a bunch of lands. But yeah, in general, I think this card looks pretty good, but just it's not quite hitting enough breakpoints to see play in a ton of decks. But I do think it's going to kill me at some point, especially at a medium red. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. This is the Let's Talk in 3 years. Runescale Stormbrood. If the Omen cards were adventures, this card would be really good. But this one is, for 1 and a blue, it's an instant Omen. It says counter target spell with mana value 2 or less, and then you shuffle this back into your deck. And then on the other side, it's a 4 mana, 2/4 flyer that casts for 3 and a red that has the ability, whenever you cast a non-creature or dragon spell, this gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So like, this is like kind of like a wee Dragonauts counterspell split card, and if you got both halves when you drew it, you'd be really stoked. Problematically, you only get one half, and so I think this card is no good. But in the world where we're playing dragons in 3 years, like they finally printed enough dragon support that we're trying to play it, I think this one looks pretty interesting just because it is interaction on the low end, which is kind of nice. And then on the high end, like having something that is often attacking as a 4/4 flyer for 4 is fine. But yeah, talk to me in a little while. Shocking Sharpshooter. This is 1 and a red for a human archer with reach. And it's 1/3. This says whenever another creature you control enters, this deals 1 damage to target opponent. I just have this here because this is another copy of Impact Tremors, and I think it's worth noting when cards like this get printed. You could potentially start looking at building like a tokensy deck that's going in on Bombardment, Impact Tremors, all these kinds of things, and this is another effect that fits in those decks. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe this card is just great now, and there's someone who's already like got that deck built and is saying like, finally, I get another one. Maybe they were thinking, let's talk in 3 years, 3 years ago, and now 3 years has come. But I'm unconvinced for now, but it's a card that it's worth noting the text box of. And then the last one I have in this slide is Lotus Light Dancers. This is a weird card. This is 2 black, green, blue for a 3/6 lifelinker, Zombie Bard. And when this enters, you search your library for a black, green, and blue card and put them into your graveyard. So it's like 3 Entombs in a trench coat is the what I saw someone online describe it as. Trent and I were talking about this card. Trent was like, you could get Narcomoeba, Dread Return, green card you want to reanimate, and then if you have one other creature in play, you can sack the Narcomoeba, the Lotus Light Dancers, and the other creature you have in play to get back like Atraxa. That's not nothing. I don't think it's good enough. But I don't know. The other thing I thought of is like, you can get Unburial Rights for your black card, and then like Atraxa, and then blue card, get whatever. I hadn't even really fully thought about what the blue card could be, but get something else that's good. Something else with flashback. I think this is a little too slow at 5 mana. At 4 mana, I think we'd be talking. You might be interested, but at 5, I think it's a little slow. But this is another one that I think is worth earmarking because triple entomb is good. Like that's a powerful effect, and there might well be a deck that wants triple entomb at some point. They printed a Walls Commander deck. I don't think there's a Walls Highlander deck yet, but maybe these cards will go in it if there ever is one. So the first one here, this one's not even really a Walls card, but this is just a cool one. This is Betor, Ancestor's Voice. This is 2 white, black, green for a legendary spirit dragon. It's a 3/5 with flying and lifelink. The beginning of your end step, put a number of 1/1 +1/+1 counters on up to target one other creature you control, equal to the amount of life you've gained this turn. Worth noting, this is going to gain you 3 life every turn it gets to attack. And then it also says return up to 1 target creature with mana value less than or equal to the amount of life you've lost this turn from your graveyard to the battlefield. That text box harder to enable, but this card is strong. It does cost 5. It's not really a Walls card, but it's from the Walls Commander deck, so I put it in the same slide. Fellothar the Steadfast. This is the Commander version of Fellothar. This is 1 white, black, green for a legendary creature, human warrior. This is a 0/5, and it has the classic Walls get to do damage text, which says each creature you control assigns damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have defender. And then it says has 3 mana, tap, sacrifice another creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, then discard cards equal to its power. So obviously, if you're sacking 0/5s, this is draw 5 cards. Look, maybe the Walls deck is there. Maybe it's like Dark Bant Walls is a playable thing. If it is, this card's an all-star in that deck. If it isn't, this card is unplayable. Is my interpretation, I would say. The last one, this one I was kind of reaching for another Walls card, to be honest, but this is Jaws of Defeat. This is 3 and a black. It's an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control enters, target opponent loses life equal to the difference between that creature's power and toughness. So burn them out, basically. I don't know. Again, if there's a Walls deck, I kind of think this is a card you might play as a way to kind of break board stalls, something like that, but probably not. And then this is the last slide, Dragons. And this is, I think this is the thing that we've all been wondering this whole time, is when is Wizards finally going to print enough dragons that, a really dedicated Dragons deck would be playable in Canadian Highlander. And I've already listed a bunch throughout the course of this set review, so this list actually doesn't really contain any like particularly exciting ones. But I think it is worth noting that they just keep printing Dragons Matters cards, and they will keep printing them because it's, I would guess, the most popular creature type in Magic. If it's not, it's the second most popular type. And so, like, Dracogenesis, this is like Rooftop Lab for dragons, like 8 mana, your dragons are free. So, like, you can envision that this card basically reads win the game, and it does. I don't think that's good enough in Highlander yet, but it does read win the game. Like Mox Jasper, now we have a Mox that cares about whether you control a dragon. There's like probably not enough cheap dragons yet for this card to be interesting, but again, they might print more, and then is this card good? Maybe. Like Parapet Thrasher, this is just a card that gets value as you play more dragons, and it's a bit of a cheaper one, which are the style of dragons you would need for the deck to be playable, I think. You would need to have more dragons in the 2 and the 3 cost range, I think, to really hammer in the playability of dragons. And then I've got on this slide as well, like Ureni the Unwritten. This is one that would like be great if if the Dragons deck was playable. And honestly, you could natural order for this card. And if you had like, say, like, I don't know, you'd have to go do like a Hyper Geo calculation to work out how many dragons you need in your deck to have top 8 reliably put a dragon into play. My intuition says the number is around 20, but I could be wrong. Yeah, it's probably around 20 to be above 80%. Let me know in the comments. That's very powerful to NO into, or you just cast it on 7, because if we are playing a Dragons deck, we gotta ramp pretty hard. And then like Dragonback Assault, like 6 mana, deal 3 damage to everything when it enters, so like clean up a small board, and then landfall, make a 4/4 dragon. It's not nothing. Like, these are just more and more Dragons cards. I don't think there's a Dragons deck yet. I might try, honestly, after the set comes out and I've done some other brewing. This set has been like really high power level broadly, so I'm not convinced. that it'll be good enough, and I'm gonna have a lot of things that I want to build. But maybe when it gets kind of later in the set, I'll try putting dragons together just to see what it might look like. Because man, there are just a lot of dragons cards now, and maybe we're getting to the point where there are enough good ones that you could play this deck that's just slamming giant things that are must kill. How we're gonna beat the combo decks is a great question. I guess, you know, worth noting, like Clarion Conqueror is a dragon, right? If we go all the way back, dragon, perfect. Here's our combo deck answer. But yeah, I think, yeah, you know, is dragons going to be a playable deck? I'm not convinced, but if it is, I'm here for it. It's gonna be fun. Whew, okay, almost 2 hours later, we made it. I hope if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I really appreciate it. Please like, comment, subscribe. My voice is definitely feeling 2 straight hours talking about Magic cards, but I'm stoked. I think this set's really cool. I'm really excited about it. Whenever we end up on Tarkir as a plane, Canadian Highlander players are definitely eating good, very happy, because they tend to put a lot of pretty high power level cards into the set, especially high power level multicolored cards, which are exciting and interesting. So I'm really stoked to get started on the set. Without further ado, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.